On a cold November morning in 1811, a confrontation on the banks of the Tippecanoe River sent shockwaves across a widening continent. This was more than a battle. It was a clash between an emerging American expansionist state and a native confederation striving to hold territory, identity, and sovereignty. Watch to uncover the human choices, misread signals, and political pressures that turned local tensions into a catalyst for the wider conflict that followed in 1812. First, we'll separate myth from record, introduce the leaders and communities often lost in quick summaries, and show how a single encounter changed alliances, rhetoric, and policy for years to come. If you want calm, evidence-driven history that brings context and clarity, stay with us, and if you enjoy this kind of deep dive, consider subscribing for more. Introduction. When a confederation of indigenous nations gathered around a new religious and political center called Prophetstown, tensions that had simmered for years crystallized into open confrontation on the frontier. The clash took place near the confluence of the Tippecanoe and Wabash rivers on November 7, 1811, and involved forces led by Governor William Henry Harrison facing followers of Tenskwatawa, known as the Prophet, who had become the spiritual figurehead of a wider movement resisting American land policies. The movement itself grew out of deep grievances, contested treaties, rapid American settlement, and a determined effort by Tecumseh and his brothers to build a pan-Indian alliance to preserve territory and sovereignty. Prophetstown was more than a camp. It was a symbol and a rallying point, combining prophetic revival with political organization. From Harrison's perspective, the gathering represented a direct threat to orderly expansion and to treaties the United States government had negotiated, most notably those that native leaders like Tecumseh rejected as illegitimate. Harrison marched from Vincennes with a mixed force of regulars and militia to confront what he characterized as a hostile concentration of warriors. He hoped to break the power of the Confederacy through a show of force and by dispersing the Prophet's followers. For the native Confederacy, the standoff was a test of unity and a moment to assert autonomy in the face of encroachment. The Prophet's blend of spiritual renewal and political resistance had attracted scores of families and warriors from several nations. The encounter itself unfolded as a preemptive attempt to disrupt the Confederacy's cohesion. Skirmishing and an early morning attack followed, after which Harrison's men burned Prophetstown and pushed the native encampment away from the riverlands they had claimed. Casualties were sustained on both sides, and while precise figures have been debated by historians, the immediate military outcome was widely reported as a tactical victory for Harrison. The psychological and political effects went well beyond the battlefield. Indigenous leaders saw the episode as further proof that land cessions would not be honored without struggle. Meanwhile, Harrison returned to American public life with a bolstered reputation that would be invoked repeatedly in later years. In the larger arc of Anglo-American and indigenous relations, the confrontation at Tippecanoe accelerated a slide into broader conflict. British agents and traders were suspected of encouraging resistance, and the clash fed into the grievances that helped precipitate war between the United States and Britain in 1812. For indigenous peoples, the breakdown of the Prophet's movement and the dispersal of Prophetstown weakened the immediate project of pan-tribal unity, even as Tecumseh continued to press his cause. For the United States, the encounter became a touchstone in political rhetoric, famously resurfacing in the presidential campaign slogan Tippecanoe and Tyler too in 1840, where Harrison's frontier reputation was used to great effect. If you'd like more concise historical summaries like this, consider subscribing for occasional updates. Rising tension on the frontier. When settlers moved westward into the Indiana and Ohio territories, the pace of land cession and settlement outstripped the fragile agreements that had been made with native communities. Farms, roads, and new towns appeared along old hunting paths, and the steady influx of migrants placed immediate pressure on resources that indigenous peoples had relied upon for generations. Treaties negotiated in distant offices were often translated into on-the-ground removals, with squatters and speculators pushing the envelope and magistrates sometimes unable or unwilling to enforce lines on the map. The result was a steady accumulation of local disputes, contested claims, broken promises, and a growing sense among many settlers that the frontier required stronger defenses. Native leaders reacted in different ways, and two brothers from the Shawnee, one a religious prophet and the other a charismatic political leader, emerged as focal points for resistance. The religious revival led by the Prophet called for a return to traditional ways, the rejection of whiskey and dependence on manufactured goods, and the spiritual healing of communities shaken by disease and displacement. His brother, Tecumseh, traveled widely, speaking to Creeks, Chickasaws, Miamis, and other nations, urging a pan-Indian confederacy that would reject piecemeal land sales and insist on collective decisions. That argument, that land could not rightly be sold by isolated chiefs for the benefit of settlers, struck directly at the transactions being concluded by territorial agents and governors. Tensions on the frontier were amplified by concrete events that settled neither fear nor policy. The governor of the territory led negotiations that ceded substantial tracts of land to the United States government, and many indigenous people saw those agreements as illegitimate or coerced. In response, settlements along rivers and near trading posts became anxious. Local militias were organized, patrols increased, and appeals for federal troops moved through the territorial legislature. Meanwhile, Prophetstown, a community that embodied both spiritual revival and political resistance, became a magnet for displaced families and for those who hoped to forge a different course, and its growing population unnerved nearby settlers. Rumor and reality fed each other. Reports of thefts and isolated attacks circulated quickly in frontier taverns and post offices, often exaggerated as they went. American officials pointed to alleged British traders and agents as sources of arms and encouragement for native resistance, while indigenous spokespeople accused territorial officials of bad faith and of provoking conflict through aggressive settlement policies. The presence of external traders, the circulation of weapons through long-distance networks, and the competing interpretations of sovereignty and land use all combined to make simple face-to-face encounters more combustible than they had been only a few seasons earlier. By the time leaders on both sides contemplated decisive action, local politics and daily survival had already hardened attitudes. Petitions from settlers asking for protection multiplied. Native councils debated defensive measures and the limits of accommodation. Casual confrontations had become part of the fabric of life on the edge of expansion, where law, custom, and force intersected uneasily. If you found this useful, please consider subscribing for more calm, concise historical narratives. Tecumseh and his vision. During the early years of American expansion, a Shawnee leader rose to prominence by arguing that indigenous nations could only survive through unity and common purpose. That leader, Tecumseh, combined persuasive oratory with relentless travel, moving through the Ohio Valley and beyond to press his case that land was not a commodity to be parceled away by individual chiefs. He spoke bluntly about the consequences of fragmented responses to settler pressure, and he insisted that tribes across different regions must recognize a shared interest in holding territory together. Tecumseh's method blended diplomacy and moral suasion. He visited communities from the Great Lakes to the lower riverlands, holding councils where he listened as much as he spoke, and he tailored appeals to local concerns while insisting on an overarching principle of collective ownership. Tenskwatawa, his younger brother, provided the spiritual revival that animated many followers. Together they created a center of political and religious life at a place where bands gathered to trade, consult, and prepare. Many chiefs who met him were struck by his combination of charisma and disciplined purpose, and some moved from skepticism to active cooperation. Central to his vision was a legal and ethical argument about land and sovereignty. Tecumseh argued that the earth belonged to entire nations and that no single chief or group of chiefs had the right to sell or cede territory that affected the whole people. This position challenged a pattern of treaties and sales that had already reduced indigenous holdings, and it reframed resistance as a defense of collective rights rather than a series of isolated disputes. He also urged cultural renewal, encouraging tribes to resist dependency on alcohol and to revive traditions that would sustain community cohesion in the face of displacement. Tecumseh's strategy sought both to build a practical alliance and to change how indigenous peoples saw themselves in relation to newcomers. He combined talks with treaty councils, alliance building with diplomatic outreach, and the persuasive force of his personality to create momentum for his idea of a confederation. Though the immediate outcomes were mixed, his insistence on unity and his critique of land sales endured as a powerful model for resistance and self-determination. If you found this concise look useful, consider subscribing for more calm, fact-based accounts of pivotal figures and movements. The Battle of Tippecanoe. During the early 19th century, rising pressure from American settlement collided with indigenous efforts to defend homelands, and one confrontation at Prophetstown, near the Tippecanoe and Wabash rivers, crystallized those tensions. William Henry Harrison, then governor of the Indiana Territory, led a mixed force of regular soldiers and volunteer militia toward a growing confederation of native nations organized around a charismatic religious leader known as Tenskwatawa, the prophet. Tecumseh, his brother and the Confederacy's principal political and military strategist, was away trying to rally support among southern tribes when the encounter occurred. The assembly at Prophetstown embodied both spiritual revival and political resistance, which alarmed American officials anxious about frontier security. Harrison's advance culminated in a night engagement, when warriors struck the American encampment before dawn. The fighting was confused and intense, produced under low light and amid hurried attempts to form lines, and contemporaneous accounts emphasize the chaos more than any clear tactical masterstroke. Artillery and disciplined volleys helped stabilize Harrison's troops. Many native participants later described the encounter as a sharp lesson in facing firearms and organized formations rather than a decisive strategic victory for either side. After the battle, Harrison's forces marched into the settlement and burned houses and stores used by the Confederacy, an act that both symbolized and intensified the rupture. Contemporary reports and later histories disagree on exact numbers and the balance of losses, so scholars proceed cautiously when citing figures. What is clear is that the engagement did not end indigenous resistance. Instead, it reshaped the dynamic. Some tribes retreated, others redoubled efforts to resist encroachment, and confidence in Tenskwatawa's prophetic authority suffered in certain quarters. Politically, the clash bolstered Harrison's reputation among many American settlers and officials who saw him as a bulwark against native resistance. That reputation would be invoked decades later in partisan politics, turning a frontier conflict into a symbol used far beyond the battlefield. The longer-term significance lies less in tactical outcomes than in the way the encounter accelerated divisions and hardened attitudes on both sides. It helped set the stage for broader conflict between the United States and those indigenous nations aligned with British interests during the larger North American War that followed. Cultural memory of the event has been contested ever since. For indigenous communities, it is part of a story of resistance and loss, while for many Americans of the period it became a rallying point for westward expansion rhetoric. If you found this account useful, please consider subscribing for more concise, grounded historical narratives. Immediate aftermath. When the engagement ended on the prairie, commanders on both sides turned to urgent, practical tasks: care for the wounded, burial of the dead, and securing remaining supplies. American forces organized makeshift hospitals in wagons and nearby shelters, and began the slow work of stabilizing the injured before moving them to larger posts. Orders were issued to gather weapons and provisions, and scouts were sent out to ensure there were no larger forces concealed nearby. Casualty reports arrived in deliberate, cautious tones, reflecting the fog of conflict. United States officers recorded roughly 62 killed and about 121 wounded, while estimates of indigenous losses varied and were often lower in official American tallies, around 50 dead according to several contemporary accounts. These figures were debated at the time and have been revised by later historians, but even conservative counts made clear the human toll and the acute strain on frontier medical resources. Burial was often hurried and communal, and commemorations took place in nearby settlement centers as families and neighbors sought to mark their losses. The physical destruction and displacement were immediate and stark. The settlement that had been at the center of the conflict was dismantled. Dwellings and stores of food were destroyed or abandoned, and many non-combatants dispersed to neighboring villages or fled farther from the frontier. This created an acute humanitarian problem for the winter months. Food stocks and shelter had been disrupted, and leaders on both sides faced the practical challenge of feeding and housing displaced people. Local supply lines were stretched, and militia commanders had to prioritize security over prolonged relief operations. Political and diplomatic consequences followed quickly. Reports sent back to territorial and federal authorities emphasized both the tactical outcome and suspicions of outside support for the opposing Confederacy, intensifying existing mistrust of imperial agents operating near the frontier. Public reaction in Eastern newspapers was energetic. The confrontation became a rallying point in local politics and helped elevate the reputation of the American commander among settlers and legislators. Conversely, the religious and political authority of the native spiritual leader who had been central to the Confederacy was severely undercut, prompting realignment among indigenous groups and driving key leaders to intensify diplomatic outreach elsewhere. Military lessons were drawn without delay. Officers criticized lapses in reconnaissance and camp security and recommended changes to marching order, night watches, and supply protection. Recruitment calls increased in the region, and garrison posts were reinforced to prevent a similar surprise attack. At the same time, the episode hardened positions and made compromise more difficult. Negotiators found themselves arguing over questions of sovereignty, land loss, and the legitimacy of frontier settlements rather than simply arranging local truces. The immediate aftermath thus combined urgent humanitarian needs, political agitation, and strategic recalibration, shaping events on the frontier for months to come. If this close look felt useful, consider subscribing for more concise, calm historical narratives. Political consequences. The clash at Prophetstown abruptly altered political calculations across the young republic, transforming a frontier skirmish into a symbol Washington could not ignore. William Henry Harrison returned to the Indiana territorial capital with a reputation that exceeded his office. He used that prestige to justify earlier initiatives, including the treaty negotiations he had led at Fort Wayne in 1809 that had acquired large tracts of indigenous land, and to press for stronger territorial governance. Local officials and settlers seized on the victory as proof that the federal government needed to assert clearer control over lands and institutions on the frontier, accelerating calls for land surveys and settlement policies. Native diplomacy and pan-Indian resistance were weakened in visible ways. Tenskwatawa, known as the Prophet, saw his spiritual and political authority undermined, which in turn fragmented the confederation his brother Tecumseh had tried to unite. Many tribal leaders, faced with loss of prestige and the threat of further military pressure, shifted strategies toward accommodation or piecemeal treaties rather than continental resistance. Tecumseh's persistence in seeking alliances, most notably with British agents in Canada, grew more urgent, but the cohesion necessary to present a united diplomatic front had been damaged. In the halls of Congress, the encounter was turned into political ammunition. Members of the so-called War Hawks cited reports from the frontier to argue that British interference and frontier instability demanded a firmer national response, and the episode sharpened partisan debates over defense spending and Indian policy. Political rhetoric hardened. Critics accused the administration of failing to protect settlers, while supporters used the narrative of threatened civilization to justify expansionist measures. Territorial representatives, bolstered by settlers' petitions, lobbied successfully for increased federal attention to frontier defense and for clearer authority to negotiate land cessions. Electoral politics absorbed the event as well, long after the smoke cleared. Harrison's image as a frontier leader and militia commander resurfaced during his presidential campaign, where the refrain associating his name with that confrontation became a catchy and effective slogan. Campaign strategists learned from the episode how a single military moment could be translated into national political capital. More broadly, policymakers used the aftermath to advance a doctrine that prioritized removal, assimilation, or negotiated cession of native lands as standard policy tools, a shift that shaped federal Indian policy for decades and altered the political landscape of the Trans-Appalachian West. For more calm, factual narratives like this one, consider subscribing. Legacy. When news of the clash at Tippecanoe reached the eastern states, it immediately reshaped political reputations and public memory. William Henry Harrison emerged as a symbol of frontier leadership, his image burnished by accounts that portrayed him as a decisive commander on the edge of the Republic. That image was later turned into a powerful political brand, famously condensed into the campaign slogan Tippecanoe and Tyler too, and it helped carry Harrison into national office decades after the fighting. The simplicity of that narrative, however, masked a more complicated reality on the ground. Beyond individual fame, the encounter altered Native American resistance in tangible ways. Tenskwatawa, known to settlers as the Prophet, saw his spiritual authority diminished after the clash, while Tecumseh's political project of a broad confederation suffered a serious setback even though he continued to resist. Native leaders adapted, regrouped, and pressed on, but their ability to hold communal lands and block settlement was increasingly constrained. Pressure for land cessions accelerated, and the event became one more justification used by officials and settlers to press claims in the Indiana Territory and beyond. The ripple effects were diplomatic as well as domestic. Suspicion that British agents had assisted Native resistance hardened viewpoints in Washington and among frontiersmen, contributing to a climate in which calls for a stronger military response gained traction. Critics and historians since have debated how directly the clash led to larger conflicts, yet it is clear that the episode intensified mistrust across the frontier and influenced later federal Indian policy. Policy choices and military preparations made in its wake set patterns that would recur in subsequent decades. Memory and commemoration have shaped how later generations understand the event. The battlefield is preserved as a park near Lafayette, Indiana, and the site hosts monuments, ceremonies, and educational programs that reflect evolving interpretations. Place names like Tippecanoe County and cultural echoes in songs and political imagery keep the encounter in public consciousness. At the same time, contemporary historians, educators, and Native communities increasingly challenge one-sided narratives, pushing for inclusion of Indigenous perspectives and deeper attention to the long-term consequences for Native nations. The conversation about the clash's meaning continues to evolve. If you'd like more thoughtful explorations like this, consider subscribing for gentle updates. A pre-dawn clash on the banks of the Tippecanoe in 1811 did more than decide a single engagement. It helped reshape the ideas, loyalties, and power struggles of a growing nation. Governor William Henry Harrison's forces met the movement led by Tecumseh and his brother Tenskwatawa, the prophet, in a struggle rooted in competing claims to land, sovereignty, and survival. The immediate result dispersed Prophetstown, raised Harrison's profile, and weakened the Pan-Indian alliance. The broader consequence was to deepen mistrust and push the United States and native nations closer to the larger conflict that would erupt in the War of 1812. This moment is complicated. It is at once a tactical encounter, a political turning point, and a human story of communities under pressure. If this account left you with questions about who remembers what and why, you are not alone. History is full of contested meanings that deserve careful attention. If you found this exploration useful, please consider subscribing for more calm, evidence-based history and leave a comment with what you'd like us to examine next. In the next episode, we will follow Tecumseh's efforts to rebuild a confederacy and trace how Tippecanoe fed into the wider conflicts of the War of 1812. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next chapter.